Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Takeaway Club, where I talk to interesting people across different walks of life to get to know their stories and, more importantly, how they got to where they are, including their motivations, habits, routines, and aspirations, some of which we can apply to our own lives. In the latest episode of the Takeaway Club podcast, I chat with Tejasvita Apte, a couples coach, legal and relationship consultant, and a TEDx speaker. She is also one of the top writers on Quora with over 120,000 followers and has written over 2,000 answers across law, relationships, spirituality, and so on. To quote Nagarajan Srinivasan, another top writer on Quora, Teja is a true polymath who knows law, politics, neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, movies, spirituality, yoga, art, poetry, literature, and the epic Mahabharata. While we don't delve deep into a lot of those subjects, we do speak a lot of politics, law, and marriages. Full disclosure, given Teja's background in law and politics, the conversation naturally takes a turn to those areas, both of which I'm totally underqualified to talk about, as I repeatedly stress in the conversation. So, all brilliance in this episode, it is all Teja's, and any faults, you can assume it is all me. Without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. So I'm super excited for this conversation,
Me
and
too. Thank you.
I'm a little embarrassed that I hadn't come across your Quora profile all these years. And
It's probably because I'm not very active right now.
I mean, that's a bit of an understatement at more than a million followers. I think you have like over 2,000 answers as well, right?
Yeah, I've been writing since 2013.
Wow.
So, or 12, I think.
So I have Deepak to thank for helping me get you on board.
Yeah, me too. He was
So
kind enough. Yeah.
yeah, he is he's like the gift that keeps giving for me personally, right from my school time. So Deepak ji, I'm sure you are listening whenever this is out, and thank you for that. Along with
Yeah,
the
thank you.
wisdom that you have been pouring over the years, I am super glad to connect with Teja and have this conversation. And I thought a good place to start would be hear your story. You have one of the most interesting journeys that anyone might hear, as a matter of fact. So, who's Teja and what is her story?
Ah, where do I start? So, I am right now into couples coaching and legal and relational consulting, which is slightly different from what I was doing before. So, by profession, I'm a lawyer. I've studied the Indian law and the French and the European law, and but I also got the opportunity to experience relationships and learn about them at a global scale. And I realized that a lot of my interest lies in interpersonal relationships and psychology and neuro linguistic programming and things like that. So I started studying about that along the way as well. And indirectly, I've been doing this when I was consulting on divorce or marriage, or I was doing a lot of consulting relating to assisted reproductive technology. So I was counseling surrogates and commissioning couples, and I was anyway doing all of that. So I realized, okay, this is something that really interests me, and I kind of made this transition. So here I am right now doing this. Let's see where things go hereafter. And what else would you like to know about my journey? It becomes very vague, actually.
Maybe we can
Anything
start off
specific?
from France. You know, France is always an exciting place to
Yeah.
start off
So I
anything
was in,
pretty much.
yeah, I moved to France last year, and that's also because I speak French. So it was one of the ways in which I could, combine my language skills and study the French and European law, because it's always been an interest of mine. So I got the opportunity to do that last year, and I got into a very, very good, I mean, the best of France actually. I got into Panthéon Sorbonne, so I was like, I cannot leave this opportunity. So that was one of the reasons why I moved, and I was looking at the things that I can learn there. So yeah, that's been the last more than 1 year actually, and then I got an opportunity to work there as well. That was the other thing on my mind, to get an international exposure of working with people from different countries, to also learn about interpersonal skills again. So, and of course the law.
Mm. So, how does it work when you have your bachelor's degree from basically studying the Indian Constitution and going on
Mm-hmm.
study masters in France? So, do you only learn like the French laws there, or I'm not sure if all of Europe follows the same law? Maybe you can shed some
No,
light on that.
no. All of Europe obviously does not follow. Each country has their own laws. But European Union, because it's trying to create this supranational entity, which is like a federation of different states. So they also have European laws to bring about a homogeneity within Europe. And of course, they've succeeded to do that in a couple of areas. In a couple of other areas, there are still disputes and things like that. So what I studied in France basically was French law mainly, and a bit of European law, because today studying French law without studying European law is not complete understanding of the French law. So that's the reason why I studied a bit of European law as well, to understand the impact of European Union on France, basically. The What I studied, like the French law that I studied, was like a brief introduction to French law, which allows me to go deeper and study. So what I studied basically was all the major aspects of law that we study in brief, so that it can prepare me if I want to give the Paris bar next year or in a couple of years. It gives a good background for that. That was what my degree was all about.
Right. That must be a very fascinating experience. And if I'm
It
not
was.
mistaken, you don't study it in English as well. It's French law
No.
in
Yeah.
French,
Yes.
right?
It was completely in French, everything, which was difficult, of course, because when I say I speak French, I had studied the language here, which means that I had studied literature and, the layman language.
Right.
Whereas the legal language obviously is more complicated. So, yeah, that was difficult, but it was also very, very interesting.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that even the English laws sound like French and Latin for common
Yes, we do
purpose.
borrow a lot, even in, yeah.
Right. So, what are some of
Yeah.
the most defining experiences that you have had in France in the last few months? Anything transformative, something that really put things in a different perspective for you?
Yeah, actually, a lot of things did. I mean, it comes with exposure, right? I mean, even if I hadn't studied law and had I just traveled abroad and stayed there, it doesn't even matter which country, it opens me up to a different kind of exposure. So, yeah, it's that. But if you have to really talk about transformative, what I really appreciate in or was really thankful for to the French speaking world was a lot of the French values that I learned about and understood, because I studied the law, that is something that is going to stay with me. The first one, for instance, is more of a Occident. I mean, Oriental and Occidental difference. Probably the difference between the East and the West, wherein the Western culture is lower on context. So they are a low context culture, which means that when they interact, it's more simpler than when we interact. Because when we interact, let's say you and I are speaking, there's a lot of context that's unspoken. When I hear your name, for example,
Mm.
I get a context as to where you're coming from. I come to know your background. I come to know your socioeconomic status, most likely. All of this is a huge amount of context. Whereas when a country is more homogeneous, where a culture is more open and has given a lot of importance to science, it is a low context culture where things are simpler comparatively. This is not to say they don't have their complexity and they don't have their problems. That's obviously not what I'm saying. But yeah, so this was something that was very different for me to see, observe, and learn from. That was something. I don't know if if it's clear enough or not.
Yeah, actually, I had one of the guests on the podcast earlier, Hari Ganapati. So
Mm-hmm.
he runs this amazing startup here in Chennai called Pick Your Trail, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which helps people travel all these foreign countries. And back when he was in college, he brought up this story when. Uh, this was an exchange program of sorts where he had to stay in somebody's house as part of the whole thing. It was very
Mm-hmm.
enriching experience where he recalled a very vivid story, pretty much on the same lines when you talk about this context, right? So that
Right.
he reached, and apparently he was tired from the journey and everything, and he was hungry. The host naturally did offer him something to eat, or but in our culture it's steep to refuse things the first time people ask you, right?
Yeah.
So he did that,
Yeah.
hoping that they would probably force him a couple of times later or something. But
Yeah.
the host ended up okay, she offered for the first time, he said no, and she was like, okay, thank you, you can go to your bed or something like that. And he was
Yeah.
super hungry the entire night.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we, in a lot of ways, there is so much things unspoken, or these intricacies
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
very peculiar to India, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm not sure, maybe it's it's a Europe thing, and maybe
Yeah, yeah. It's what it's not necessarily very peculiar to India because it's probably a Asian thing.
right. Mm.
So
So,
yeah.
uh, as someone who has studied law in two different countries with a
Mm-hmm.
ton of perspective, and you have a lot more context than a lot of people practicing law per se.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is the current landscape like for you as a lawyer when you look at India? Right. Maybe I don't want to get into the politics of things or anything,
Mm-hmm.
but more clarity on what I'm talking about. You have all these bills getting passed. Things like getting rid of triple talaq, the
Mm-hmm.
adultery law, and decriminalizing gay marriage. Just some of the things that, as a passive observer, that I see in the judicial system in just the last couple of years, right? So this,
Mm-hmm.
for me, it feels like this is the most progressive things have been for India as such. Okay?
Um, yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. Yeah, it's definitely progressive, and that's something that was quite late. It should have been long back, but yeah, we are at least moving towards it. I see these changes, and I'm of course hoping for more because there's a lot more. Like for example, Uniform Civil Code should probably be the next um, online that we need to have. We also need to have a lot of laws which take away the unscientific parts of our um, I mean, legal system where it's based more on religion or things like that, which are not necessarily in vogue anymore and should not be impacting people's lives. So yeah, I think it's good where we are moving. It's slow, but it's good.
So on the same lines again, tying to your French his connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is something that, when you compare the two systems, what is something that you really like here, and what is something that pisses you off?
Okay, so firstly, we cannot compare the two systems; they're very different. With each one working for that country. I cannot imagine the Indian system in France and I cannot imagine the French system in India. It won't work, right? So the countries are right to follow what they follow, and it is it is a success at least. But what do I like about India? What I really, really like about India, the laws, is the fact that we have the British system, that we have precedents, that we are a common law country. I think any student of law, especially the more we get exposed to other legal systems, realizes how elegant and beautiful common law is. And so, yeah, that's something that I absolutely like about India, and it works for India.
What's the
What?
common law? I mean, sorry to be a noob here.
Okay. So basically, the difference between the common law basically is a law which takes, so all of the countries which follow the English legal system are common law countries. So basically, usually the countries that were colonized by England, but basically we inherited their legal system. So for India, I have to speak for India because I mean law is very, very territorial and it depends on each country. But for India, for example, the fact that we have precedents, which means that the previous judgments are binding, or the higher court's judgments are binding on the lower courts. This, for example, is something that is uh, a a feature of the common law system. So this is really elegant. This is really useful. So that's something that I really like about the other thing is like we are not, so bunch of other features, like we have delegated legislation. We have a constitution that's supreme. The law of the land is not the civil code, so to speak. So I'm not sure if I'm getting too technical, but what I'm basically trying to say is at the base, it's very different from a civil law country like France.
Right.
So it's something that you cannot interchange them. Each country has its history, and it works because it works for that country and that population. For example, to imagine India without a federal structure, like laws at the state level as well as the municipal level and the central level, we need, because we are such a huge country and it's so diverse, that it's not possible for the parliament in Delhi
Mhm.
to actually make laws for what happens in a small town in Goa. It's just not possible, right? Whereas France is a much smaller country, much more homogeneous, and this is, I mean, it's more legicentric country, which means the constitution is not as important as the civil code is. Whereas we don't have such a thing as civil code in India. We have a bunch of different laws covering different topics. So the system is very, very different.
So,
You cannot really,
which
um,
brings me to what is something that you don't like about the system.
I think I touched upon it when we spoke a little bit. I actually like systems. I like the law. What I have a problem with is people, and that is a much more complicated problem to solve. So it's less about the system and more about lack of integrity in people. Now, how do you solve that, right? Because lack of integrity is not only a feature of the legal system; it's a feature of every person's life everywhere, right? As students, we lack integrity. As teachers, we lack in, I mean, in every domain, it's a problem. So the thing that really bothers me is this. It's not the system. I'm sorry if I'm like disappointing with my answer, but if it is anticlimactic, but yeah, that's really what I believe.
Yeah, that is a bitter pill to swallow, right?
Hmm. And a
And
much more difficult problem to solve.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe yeah, I think like you say, this whole anything that's got to do with law or legal system, that's like a never-ending rabbit hole to speak, right?
Yes,
So
it's complex. Of course, it's complex. Yes.
yeah, maybe let's one of I'm switching gears a bit from you know
Mm-hmm.
the law centric conversation that I put you in the opening few minutes.
Yeah.
One of the other interesting things about your profile is a large part of whose life revolves around the Indian legal system. And
Mm-hmm.
naturally, as a lawyer, you have polar side to yourself, right? With
Mm-hmm.
relationship counseling and coaching people and everything. And to cap that off, you are a brilliant writer. So
I'm not sure, but thank you.
this is not a combination that you usually see in people, right? I feel like that's an interesting juxtaposition. So, what
Yeah,
gives?
I hear you. But here's, let me try to do something. Let me try to do the opposite, in fact. Let me point out the similarities. Yeah. That would tell you why it makes a lot of sense. So, as a lawyer, or as a coach, or as even a thinker for that matter, or even a writer, what is my forte? What my forte is, or what I actually study and specialize in, is clarity. It's clear thinking, right? So it's clarity actually that helps a lawyer win a case. It's also clarity that helps me help my clients when I'm going through a relationship coaching session. Because when people come to me, whether they were coming in the past as litigants or as clients to a lawyer, and now when they're coming to me as couples or people who want advice relating to marital discord or things like that, um, what they're actually coming to me for is because they're stuck with something. They're stuck in a situation where they're not able to decide. Now, before, when I was a lawyer, I could tell the procedure of the law, like the next steps, the legal steps that a person is supposed to take. But even before that, so that takes clarity as well, because there are a bunch of things that people can do. There are like 5 or 6 ways that people can go, but based on the person, what they want, their cultural background, their expectations, I'd advise what exactly is the best suitable course for them. It's something similar that I actually do. It's just that it happens slightly before anybody takes a legal step. So here too, I help them gain clarity with cutting the clutter that's going on in their mind, dividing the issues, and dealing with them one by one. So I don't see that as anything that's in opposition. In fact, it's quite coherent.
that
Does
that's definitely a um, very interesting perspective, right?
yeah.
Like you said, at the end of the day, the common thread is, in fact, clarity. So one of the things that you focus on in a lot of your Quora answers are you put uh, you place as your expertise is marriages. So one of the things that I've been super curious about is the way marriages has evolved in the last 10 years alone. And I noticed that anytime I have a discussion, especially with people from the previous generation,
Mm-hmm.
so we have a very uh, contrasting views on the marriage system as such. Someone who's growing up in 2020 to say even someone who went through the system like a decade back, right? So
Mm-hmm.
why? What do you think is behind the evolution of the way we look at marriages, right? From where
Yeah.
it has transformed from being something that was the cornerstone of your life to being
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is very interesting, and this is not just something that's happening in India. It's actually happening globally, and I mean, in India, we are slightly late if you actually think about it. But yeah, we're getting there. So basically, what's a cornerstone model of marriage? A cornerstone model of marriage is where people marry young uh, and build their life around the marriage, right? Where in the marriage, whatever are the mistakes, the pitfalls, the problems are considered normal, because every couple goes through that.
right.
And so regardless of any of that, you never ever think of a divorce or separation. right? Because it's around that, around your marriage, your entire life is built. People would marry before they get a house or buy anything for themselves, or people would marry immediately after they're, um, old enough, they just finished their education, and they just got their first job or something, and they would marry before. And women would marry even earlier. So this was the cornerstone model of marriage. From there, we've actually moved in 3 generations now. Marriages have become something uh, that's completely disconnected from what it was before. So this is the first time, for example, uh, that you have couples where both of them are working the equal amount of time. Both of them are probably earning the equal amount of money, right? So this is something very new. This probably did not exist even 1 generation back. It was a rarity. Now it's becoming a norm, at least in urban India. So this is the change, and then the change that happens from Cornerstone, which was the previous kind of marriage, the model which is changed to Capstone, which means that people don't marry early. The age of marriage is getting pushed ahead and ahead. The age of children is getting pushed ahead and ahead. So people are having children late. People are having less number of children because women are working. So there are a number of reasons behind this, and because we want to get all our ducks in order before we marry. So the idea today, like in my generation and even more your generation, and even it's going to change more with future generations, is that I want to solve my life first. I want to sort everything before I marry. So basically, I want to date people. I want to earn my money. I want to make a career. I want to have a place to stay. I want to have my own car. I want to buy. So all of those things which 3 generations back people did in their 40s and 50s, as they moved along in the marriage, is something, everything that we want to do before. And then when we are ready and when we are settled, we will marry. So this is capstone. So marriage acts as a capstone to people's lives, basically. So this is, I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's going towards this direction, right? So this is how it's
This is a
transformed.
brilliant account of where things stand, actually, right? You put it in an
Yes.
amazing manner. Uh, my one wonderment to quote
Mm-hmm.
Ross Geller is how do you deal with this when on one hand the way the current generation looks at things has become more and more liberating in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
we call it forward thinking, liberating, or whatever it is, right? Again, not
Mm-hmm.
get caught with the terms or the political terms like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you still have the people from previous generation who are essentially responsible for again responsibly in quotes, right, who take it
Mm-hmm.
upon them to make these decisions for the next generation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand you have a kid who's exposed to totally different things like the latest Netflix shows,
Mm-hmm.
all these sitcoms
Yeah.
where you are far ahead of the curve of where
Mm-hmm.
things are heading as such. On the other hand,
Yeah.
you have these parents from previous generation
Mm-hmm.
who are again not a judge or anything, but who are still in their shell, uh,
Yeah.
to put it metaphorically. And I hear a lot of conflicts arising just on this one subject as well, right? This goes true for a lot of things, but again, when you try to change this fundamental their fundamental belief about marriage, most of the times it ends
Mm-hmm.
up becoming a huge issue, right? So
Yeah.
how do we get there in a more amicable manner?
Yeah. So the basic thing to understand here is that you cannot please everybody, firstly. Secondly, certain amount of conflicts between generations is normal. It's been happening, and it's happening more now because the transitions or the changes are huge. right? This is the generation, for example, for the first time, where everything is up for discussion between a couple, between me and my husband or boyfriend, for example. In this generation, for the first time, we are going to discuss things like, okay, um, uh, whose money is going to be used for what matter, right? Who is going to be making more money? Whose career will take a backseat? After the kids are born, when the child wakes up in the middle of the night, who's going to wake up, right? Who's going to take care of the, so all of these discussions were not something that were discussed before. The roles were fixed. This was not, whatever was outside of the house, the man dealt with it. Whatever was inside the house, the woman would. So there was this equitable distribution of work, which was very, very clear. What has changed now? Yeah, you can say that people are more liberated. Of course, yeah, there's more the relationship has become more egalitarian, where both of them are becoming more and more equal in terms of their desires and wants as well, and their assertiveness as well. But what's the flip side, or what's the difficulty of this, is basically, while it brings a lot of flexibility to the couple, it also brings up a lot of negotiation, for which we are extremely ill prepared, right? Because the models that we grow up seeing are not the models that we are going to create. So we have to understand here that what is happening is a transition that people are going through all alone, with no help or very less help. Which is why, if you have to solve the situation amicably, it's something that both these generations have to understand, that okay, this is changing, nothing good or bad. There is no point labeling it, it's just how it is. So while this is changing, how do we help people, through the change? How do we make people understand that okay, there is a transition and everything is up for negotiation? Okay, that is the case. How do you negotiate it well? How do you negotiate it equitably? That's something that people can help you with. The more experience you have experience of negotiation, you have experience of dealing, like I will never take away something that the previous generation has, which is more experience in terms of the life that they've seen, except that experience has to be given a different context now, and it has to be adapted. So this is something that can only come by reflection and communication. But beyond a point, you cannot please everybody. So, and what's really important in interpersonal relationships are boundaries, right? So what are you willing to listen to, and what are you willing to compromise on, is something that each person has to decide for their own self. But boundaries are really important. So it's a
That's,
complex thing. I mean, it doesn't have
yeah,
an easy answer.
it's like you have a car, right? And the car's engine is like the latest one, and it's electric powered, and it has like the best windshield and everything. But instead
Yeah.
of the wheels, you still have like two horses, tied to the front. And,
I
certain
like your metaphor.
certain aspects have progressed beyond our
Yeah.
imagination,
Yeah.
but we are left wanting, we are playing basically catch up in other equally important other pieces of the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
So, and it doesn't help that uh, the people, the so-called conservative generation, right,
Yeah.
and they are getting pulled into the filter bubble, where they are less and less open to adopting these
Yeah.
newer way of doing
Yeah.
things. And on the
Yeah.
other hand, you have the current generation uh, who's again drawn towards a different filter bubble, right? Did
Yeah.
you get a chance to watch the social dilemma?
Of course I did. Of course,
Yeah,
it's
see,
brilliant.
this is
Yeah.
exactly what they portray in
Yeah.
beautiful manner, right?
Yeah.
And even if you take personally, I have such a hard time convincing the closest ones from the previous generation to even sit down and watch that film, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be a real challenge, right? and
Yeah.
and like you say, there has to be that realization that things are not going to be the way they used to be, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
And this is where people like you, right? People who are experts come in and actually help out people, right? And
Yeah.
again, this is another problem, right? There is still the stigma around counseling, and I was talking to Indu, the psychologist, only yesterday. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
on one of the other episodes, and this is exactly what we were discussing about as well. You are at a time where you need help like never before, right?
Yeah.
Whether it is psychologists or it's life coaches or relationship counselors. And the sad part is that's still not the case with the majority of the population. That
Yeah.
willingness to accept that you need help, right?
Yeah. It's because we don't allow failure. We don't accept failure. Whereas failure is actually a beautiful thing, right? And whether you, I mean, accept it or not, it's bound to happen in one domain or the other, because that means you tried. That means you did something. The only way to not fail is to never try, right?
Right.
So this is and also the other side of it, that we are extremely risk averse as countries. I mean, we cannot take any risk. We cannot make a single mistake, and that's not how life works.
Right. That's true, right? Even before the chat, I was talking to you about this whole risk taking thing, right? In a around
Mm-hmm.
the professional circle, and only now, uh, you know, uh, that I'm starting to see that the only way to ensure that long term happiness is to take the risk that you want to, right? And
Of course,
this when you're spot on about failure, but the thing is, it's perceived failure, right? It's not
of
really
course, of course,
failure. Mm,
of course. It goes without saying.
right. And yeah, that's the part, right? And seeing something like a divorce as a failure.
Yes, which is yeah, it's how it's seen, and it contributes to the taboo and everything. It's also, I mean, if you have depression, it's seen as failure as well. I mean, in so many ways, if you have any mental health problem, it's seen as a failure. So um, I think beyond a point, we should not be paying much heed to these kind of judgments,
Mm.
because that's what it is, and it does not do anybody any good. So it should just be ignored.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all in for not judging,
Yeah.
but I'm also
No, no, I
worried
mean,
that
yeah.
the judges.
Yeah, yeah, I know, I know. I was just trying to say that we should stop I mean, we should be ignoring people who are judging, basically. Not to say that you're judging. I was just saying the people
Yeah, I
who
mean,
judge
yeah,
should just,
I
and these kind of
understand.
judgments should just be ignored.
So I actually one of the things that I ask people in general in these conversation is if you had a billboard in which you could say anything, and the billboard gets placed in every city in the world, so what is something you want to say? And I've always felt like if I had that chance is
Mm-hmm.
to be something like whose life is it anyway, if,
Yeah,
if
true.
everybody just asked that question, I
Yeah,
I feel like we'll pretty much solve 90% of the
yeah,
clashes and the riots and everything that we have.
that's true. That's true. If I were doing that, I'd probably add something to that, like whose life is it anyways is an interesting one. But I'd also add that, you know what, own your shit, own your life. You are the owner of your life. You are the person who's writing a story here. So own it.
So,
That's really important.
well, this has been interesting, and I'll switch gears again
Mm-hmm.
because since I mentioned that I'm going to have this conversation today, I had a lot of people who really wanted to ask you things
All
basically.
right.
People who had come across you on Quora and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just have a bunch of questions, and I'm not going to go into the details of who
Mm-hmm.
is it from or where is it from or anything like that. And
Sure.
they may not also overlap with whatever that we have been discussing so far, right? So
Sure.
I'll just jump this into in some random.
All right.
The first thing is, I think this is, mm, yeah, I think this is from a lawyer's lens, I'd say. Who decides
Mm-hmm.
freedom of speech and where is the line drawn?
Who decides freedom of speech? Usually the law. Okay. So now, where is the line drawn depends on the country, and depends on which law we are talking about. But freedom of speech is something that's it really depends on other political concepts. It's not just independent. So freedom of speech and expression depends on what's your take on religion. What's your take on certain other taboos of the society that you can't talk about? Let's say Holocaust denial, right? For example, Holocaust denial is something that's illegal in most of Europe. So that's something that's considered really wrong in that part of the world. So it has a context of political concepts around it. So in India, for example, we are a secular country, but our secularism is way different from, let's say, the French brand of secularism, which is called laïcité. So where they're very clear about their freedom of speech and expression, and it's how important it is. Whereas we have multiple issues. Like one of the issues is like there isn't a lot of clarity over offense and what's considered offense. Secondly, a lot of this is manipulated by politicians themselves, right? These adds to the conundrum in a place like India. So even if I were to give you, there isn't a clear cut answer to what is freedom of speech and expression, where are the lines drawn. Whereas in the French context, for example, I can tell you exactly where the lines are drawn, and it's extremely clear for the French.
Why
That's
is it the same not true for in a country like ours?
because because France has had its Renaissance and its French Revolution in the 1700s, right? So they've and we are a very young country, and also we are a religious country, whereas France, for the most part, is completely secular. So our secularism is basically that the state will not favor one religion over the other. That's our secularism. Whereas the French brand of secularism, the state will not interfere in the matters of religion at all. Not in the sense that we hear it, in the sense that the state will not change. Like we have personal laws, for example, in India. In France, you will never have that. So in the French context, in laïcité, for example, what they make it very clear to just to tell you is they say that criticizing people or racism or races, okay, is illegal.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's where they draw the first line. However, criticizing ideas or concepts is not illegal.
Right.
So religion is an idea or a concept.
Mhm.
So it's an opinion. So that is 100% open to criticism.
Mm.
But criticizing or saying things that are offensive to, let's say, Jewish people or black people, that's illegal, because you're actually criticizing people. You see the big difference there.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, probably I don't have that political clarity to take a stance on these things, right?
I understand it's also very legal. I mean, when what I'm describing is of course very legal also.
And something on those same lines is, say, I mean, with freedom of speeches. Uh, One thing that I've been curious is where do these new age platforms come in with respect to all these laws we have? To give you an example, is like you have these shows from Netflix, which doesn't really follow the same censorship laws that typical television
Mm-hmm.
does, right? So because currently they have the freedom to do so.
Yeah.
Uh,
Before I mean give you a clear, like a direct answer, basically I have to just say that any regulation, to my eyes, is not a problem, because that's the job of the government to regulate, right? But whether it's banning something, whether it's including something, and the details of that, and how does that change the nature of one platform to the other, and why, all that is relevant. But you cannot have an opinion without actually reading the law and reading the purpose of the law.
so I'll move to the next one here.
Mm-hmm.
Is liberals and conservatives as simple as left and right in India? Oh, I
Ah,
am so inadequate to ask these questions.
I know.
To be honest.
Honestly, no, because the I mean, this divide of liberals and conservatives, I don't know if it's necessarily the divide that we should be focusing on. In the sense that I'll tell you, world over, there is a division between the left and the right, right? And the details depends on each country's politics. What's left in one country and what's right in the other. The general norms are similar, but the details can go different. Um, what I'm trying to get at basically is this division of liberals and conservatives and this polarization that is taking place more and more in the world now is less about, I think, liberals and conservatives. There's enough studies about this actually. It's more about people who are political and people who are not political. Okay. So, to give you an example, a recent study that was done was basically asking people things like, just asking you one question, okay, without any more information. Like, for example, let's say you're a liberal and you've been asked, or let's say you're a Democrat and you've been asked that, your child is probably going to marry a Republican. Where do you stand on that? Your answer really, I mean, we think the answer depends on whether the person is liberal or Democrat, but sorry, Democrat or Republican. But it really depends on how political that person is. So most people, when asked this one question, answered that I would have a problem if it's the opposite side, right? But let's say you gave them another qualifying piece of information. So let's say you ask them, okay, you're a Republican and your child is going to marry a Democrat, but that person is really not interested in politics and is really not going to talk about it. Suddenly, the number of people who had a problem with their child marrying the opposite side dropped, because now they have this additional piece of information which tells them that the person is not very political. So, this polarization is thus less between, I think, liberals and Democrats, or liberals and Republicans, sorry. Yeah. And more about how political certain people are and how political certain people are not.
Wow, this is another interesting one. How is sex a taboo in India when scriptures and sculptures tell a different story?
Well,
Now, it's a very valid ask in my opinion, at least.
yeah, no, but I think it's because we confuse between two things here, because see, the scriptures, or there are temples which showcase sex very openly, is coming from a very different context than you having a conversation about sex with your child, right? So, or sitting in the same drawing room and watching a movie which is showing two people kissing as a family with your parents and children there. Do you hear? So these two are very different contexts. So there is taboo in one, but not taboo in another. And that's because those two are very different contexts. These same people are not going to visit Khajuraho with their children. Do you see what I mean?
Mm.
So the the scriptures or these temples are relics of a past that today don't um, kind of interact with your present life at all. But the context in which we live, the context in which we interact with the opposite sex, the kind of ideas that we have, the kind of negativity that surrounds sex, is something that we see in day to day life. That's where the taboo comes from. So those two are extremely different contexts.
Yeah, again, this is another interesting perspective. I think you're going to like the next one. This is somehow an extension of the previous question,
Mm-hmm.
but from the other side, right? Again, the other side in quotes there,
Mm-hmm.
just to clarify. And I'll read out the entire question. It's a fairly
Mm-hmm.
long question as well. The Hindu scriptures does not recognize divorce between couple, nor
Mm-hmm.
does it recognize same-sex marriages. The secular state has no say in religious rituals of its subjects. Why
Mm-hmm.
pass a Hindu Marriage Act and include divorce in this? Uh, Again, a disclaimer is, however, with increasing cases of abuse and other other all these extreme cases, provision for divorce is very much needed. I'm not denying that, but just curious about the other part of the question.
Okay, there are a number of questions here. Uh, so, uh, uh, I think it began with the fact that Hindu scriptures don't really recognize divorce, right? And same sex marriages. So, let's divide the two. Same sex marriages are not recognized by the law even now. So, all that the law has done is decriminalized homosexuality, which means that um, people will not face a jail sentence. That's about it. But there is no such thing as same sex marriages, at least now on paper, anywhere in India, recognized by the law. Hindu scriptures don't recognize divorce is, yeah, but we don't live by the scriptures. In fact, most Hindu people would have a huge problem if religion starts governing their day-to-day life, including me. Even though I do fall in the category of a Hindu as far as this country goes, but um, a divorce is not recognized because look, the scriptures don't recognize the divorce because the scriptures really believe in marriage not just for one life but for seven lives. This is the reason why there is no divorce. However, modern life does not really work like that, right? So we have marriage, and that's why we need to have a divorce, because if two people want to be together, they should be allowed to separate if they don't want to be together, because we live with fundamental freedoms in the country. Why do we have uh, why pass a Hindu Marriage Act was the question.
Yeah, I think it
Well,
was.
because
Why does the Hindu Marriage Act contain divorce as?
because it has marriage in it. It
Mm,
has to have divorce in it. Because how can you just say that two people once married will never be able to separate? I mean, it's just violation of people's fundamental rights. So that trumps religion.
mm.
So
Just to clarify on a personal level, so
mhm.
does that work the same way for other religions as well, or?
Yes, you have separate laws for each religion of marriage as well as divorce. You have the Christian, you have a different law for Christians, you have a different law for Parsis, you have a different law for Muslims. So why do we have different laws is another question. That's
Mhm.
an independent question, because we don't have uniform civil code um, up until now. That's the reason why we have personal laws are governed by religion. Did I answer the question?
So actually, I think that would be an interesting place to wrap this conversation. So,
Mm-hmm.
I, I've why is there so much disconnect between law and a common person? Unlike something like, say, to take a parallel from my industry, say if Facebook, Twitter they rule the world, every person, even in tier 2, tier 3, they're comfortable with Facebook or Twitter or Amazon
Mm-hmm.
or say Swiggy, whatever it is, right? The same goes for shopping, right?
Mm-hmm.
But why can't, I wouldn't ask why can't it be the case for law? How do you see uh, this problem? How do you think we'll, moving forward, we will reduce that disconnect between a common person and the law that they are governed by?
Uh, I'm not sure I'm convinced of the disconnect in the sense that I understand that the common person feels disconnected with the law. That is very different from the disconnect actually being there, right? You're actually going on a highway and you meet with an accident. It's the most common occurrence, right? It can happen to anybody.
Right.
You, let's say you just two cars just banged.
Hmm.
Nobody has to die. Nothing more complicated than just a minor accident has to occur for the law to come into the picture. So I mean, I
Yeah, I
don't
mean,
think that.
that's
Yeah.
there, right? See, I have to give you a very specific example. Let's say let's even take the current scenario. Let's say I drive on the road, but I don't wear a mask, right? And the police stops me,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
typical conversation, I think, whether it's mask or license or whatever it is, the conversation is, uh, do you want to pay this much fine, or do you want to get away with it? Taking another discourse,
Yeah.
right?
No. So
That's because there is not a
that's what
clarity, right?
I yeah. So I think the better question is not there actually being a disconnect between people and the law, but people feeling that or people not knowing the law. That disconnect, yeah, there is. But the reason behind that is that the law is not meant for people to understand it. The law is meant to govern. Now, that is a complicated thing to do, right? You need to really make room for exceptions. You really need to make room for procedures. You really need to make room for the context of that situation. All of that to be drafted is not easy. You can't really have a law which reads like how your Facebook post or Twitter will read so that it's accessible to common people. So it's complicated. Also, it gets more complicated because we as society have evolved. It's become more diverse. It's become more crowded. It's become more complicated in the sense that there are more and more third parties being included to everything. So if you had just about so if it was just between a doctor and a patient, let's say, or a contract between two people, you now have somebody who is insuring that contract. There's a third party who's coming.
Mm.
It gets complicated with things like that. It's just a minor example, but it's all of these complications that makes it difficult for common people to feel like they can access the law. But then again, the point is not to make a law uh, that's like poetry, that everyone loves or something. That's not the point. The point is to govern, to effectively remove conflicts from the society.
That's true. Law, law sounds a lot like Batman.
Law is complicated. That's true. It's a technical thing.
Yeah. Mm. Well, that wraps one of the most interesting and offbeat topics that I have gotten
Yeah.
the chance to host. You know, uh, so uh, hopefully, I my inadequacies in a lot of topics that we discussed, particularly politics, does not take away the insightful aspects from your side, right? So
I don't think. I think it helps the fact that you brought in a layman's perspective. I think that's what's going to be more relatable. for people.
Mhm.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah, I'll hope so, and maybe we should do a round two sometime. Yeah,
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to.
where I can get a better grasp of things, and we could have a more intense or heated exchange.
Sure.